The cold was a living thing, a predator that had found its way through the plush velvet of the carriage seats and into my bones. I had become a statue carved from ice, my breath a ghost in the small dark space. The only warmth was the hateful foreign weight of the gold band on my left hand. It felt less like a ring and more like a shackle, a perfect gleaming circle of my own personal hell. It was done. I was married. I was the property of Lord Fenwick, a man whose breath smelled of decay and whose eyes held the vacant cruelty of a spider. My wedding dress, a simple thing of cast-off muslin my stepmother had deemed sufficient for the occasion, was already creased and dirtied from my scramble into the Duke of Blackwood's carriage. It was an act of pure, unthinking desperation, a flight response from a creature too long caged. I had seen the carriage waiting unattended near the side gate of the chapel, the ducal crest on its door, a silent testament to a power so far beyond my own sphere, it felt like something from a fairy tale. The coachman was gone, likely seeking warmth in the chapel's kitchens. It was a chance, perhaps my only one. So I had run. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, my feet barely making a sound on the damp cobblestones. I wrenched the heavy door open, scrambled inside, and pulled it shut, plunging myself into the opulent darkness. Here, surrounded by the scent of expensive leather and old books, I waited for the inevitable discovery, for the furious shouts of my new husband, for the cold, triumphant smile of my stepmother, Evangeline. Every sound outside the carriage was a threat. The distant cheer from the small, pathetic wedding party, the clatter of a horse's hoof, the low murmur of voices. I was a mouse hiding in a lion's den, praying the lion was a sound sleeper. I had lived my life as a ghost, a pale shadow flitting through the halls of my own home. After my mother died and my father remarried, I learned the art of invisibility. My stepmother, Baroness Evangeline, was a woman carved from ambition and sharp edges. Her daughter, my stepsister Isolde, was her masterpiece, a radiant, laughing beauty destined for a brilliant match. I, with my quiet nature and my preference for books over balls, was a smudge on her perfect portrait of the family. I was plain, they said, too serious, a burden. My father, a man hollowed out by grief and cowed by his new wife's iron will, simply looked away. The marriage to Lord Fenwick was Evangeline's solution to the problem of me. He was old, riddled with debt, but he had a title that, when polished with my dowry, what little of it Evangeline hadn't already absorbed into her own accounts, could still gleam. It was a transaction. I was the goods, sold off to the highest, most convenient bidder. The ceremony was a hurried, humiliating affair in the family's dreary chapel, witnessed by a handful of Fenwick's cronies and my family, who looked upon it as a chore completed. Isolde had looked uncomfortable, a flicker of pity in her eyes, but she had said nothing. She never did. The carriage lurched. My heart leaped into my throat. The door opened, flooding the interior with the gray light of a dying afternoon. A figure filled the doorway, a tall, broad silhouette against the gloom. He did not speak. He simply stood there, and the air in the carriage grew thick and heavy, charged with a power that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It was him, the Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont. I'd seen him only once before, at a distance. He was a legend, a recluse spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. Cold, they called him, severe, haunted by the tragedy that had claimed his wife and child years ago. He had arrived at the chapel for some business with the vicar, an unexpected and formidable presence that had sent a ripple of shock through our small gathering. He had not attended the ceremony itself, but I had felt his eyes on me as I stood at the altar, a sacrificial lamb waiting for the slaughter. I dismissed it as a figment of my overwrought imagination. Now, he was here. His gaze swept over my huddled form, taking in the cheap dress, the wildness in my eyes, the desperation clinging to me like a shroud. I expected rage, contempt, a brusque order to be gone. Instead, his eyes, the color of a winter storm, held a strange, unnerving stillness. They were the most observant eyes I had ever seen, and I felt stripped bare beneath their scrutiny, every layer of my carefully constructed invisibility peeled away. "You are trespassing," he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the small space completely. It was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of emotion as his expression. I could not find my own voice. It was a rusty, unused thing. I could only stare, my mind a frantic scramble of apologies and pleas that died before they could form. His gaze dropped to my left hand, which I was clutching against my chest as if to ward him off. He saw the ring. A flicker of something, I could not name it, passed through his eyes. It was not pity, it was not anger. It was something harder, colder. For a terrifying second, I thought he was judging me, seeing me as some faithless bride fleeing a holy vow. He stepped fully into the carriage, shutting the door behind him. The space, already small, seemed to shrink to nothing. I pressed myself further into the corner, the velvet scratching against my cheek. He sat on the opposite seat, his posture immaculate, his presence overwhelming. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. I felt like a specimen under glass. "Lord Fenwick is your husband now, is he not?" the Duke asked. The question was a simple statement of fact, yet it landed like a blow. I managed a nod, a jerky, pathetic movement. "A man of questionable repute and even more questionable finances," he continued, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Your stepmother has made a poor investment." He was not speaking to me, but to himself, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. The assessment was so blunt, so brutally accurate, that it shocked a word from my throat. "Please," I whispered, the sound fragile as a moth's wing, "please do not make me go back to him." He looked at me then, truly looked at me. The stillness in his gaze was replaced by an intense, focused curiosity. It was as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Why did you choose my carriage?" "It was here," I stammered, the answer as inadequate as I felt. It was the only way out. "Out of a marriage or out of your life?" The question was sharp, precise, cutting through my panic to the heart of the matter. Tears I had refused to shed all day pricked at my eyes. "I do not know," I confessed, the admission a raw, painful truth. "They are one and the same." He was silent for a long moment, his gloved fingers steepled before him. The carriage smelled of him now. Rain-damp wool, clean soap, and something else, something wild and elemental, like the scent of a storm approaching over an open moor. He was not what I had expected. The rumors painted him as a monster, a brooding hermit. The man before me was something far more dangerous. Intelligent. "My destination is Blackwood Manor," he said at last, his tone decisive. "That is a day's journey from here. Lord Fenwick will not find you there tonight. You will come with me." It was not a question, it was a command, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been disobeyed in his life. I stared at him, bewildered. Why? Why would this powerful, reclusive duke involve himself with a ruined, terrified girl hiding in his carriage? It made no sense. Pity? A strange whim? A cruel game? Why? The word escaped me before I could stop it. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a trace of something other than cold observation. It was a flicker of memory, distant and surprising. 5 years ago, he said, his voice a low murmur, at the midsummer fete on the Abbey grounds, a young woman stood by the crumbling western wall and asked her father why the architect had used a cantilevered buttress on a non-load-bearing section. She wondered if it was an aesthetic choice or a mathematical miscalculation that had been corrected mid-construction. I froze. I remembered that day. The sun had been warm on my face. My father had still occasionally listened to me then, before Evangeline had convinced him my intellectual pursuits were unseemly. The ruined abbey on the ducal lands was my favorite place on earth, a beautiful broken skeleton of stone and faith. I had spent hours there with my sketchbook, tracing the lines, trying to understand the minds of the men who had built it. "That was you," he stated, his gaze unwavering. I could only nod, speechless. He remembered. Of all the people in the world, this severe, solitary duke remembered a question I had asked 5 years ago. He had seen me. Not as the plain, quiet girl, not as the inconvenient stepdaughter, but as someone with a mind, with a thought that had, for some inexplicable reason, lodged itself in his memory. "Your father dismissed the question," the Duke continued, a faint, almost imperceptible edge to his voice. "He told you not to trouble yourself with such things. I, however, have been troubling myself with it ever since." He leaned forward slightly, the intensity in his gaze pinning me to my seat. "So, tell me, miss, forgive me, Lady Fenwick, was it aesthetics or miscalculation?" The world outside the carriage, the hateful ring, the monstrous husband, the suffocating family, seemed to recede. Here, in this dark, confined space, a man I did not know had asked me a question about the one thing I loved. He had offered me a lifeline, not of escape, but of recognition. And in that moment, for the first time in a decade, I felt the stirring of a forgotten sensation. I felt seen. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a long, strange dream. I sat opposite the Duke, the rhythmic sway of the carriage a counterpoint to the frantic beating of my own heart. He did not press me for more conversation. After my fumbling attempt to explain the architectural theories behind the Abbey's construction, he had simply nodded, a thoughtful expression on his severe features, and fallen silent. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared quiet, a space to breathe. For the first time in my life, my quietness did not feel like a flaw. It felt respected. We arrived long after nightfall. Blackwood Manor was not a house, it was a fortress. It rose from the moorland like a jagged outcrop of granite, its windows dark and watchful under a sliver of moon. It was as formidable and uncompromising as its master. A groom took the horses, and the Duke led me through a massive oak door into a great hall that swallowed the light from the few lit candelabras. The air was cold, smelling of stone and wood smoke and centuries of solitude. A woman in a severe black dress, her hair pulled back in a tight graying bun, appeared from the shadows. She was the picture of a stern housekeeper, yet her eyes, when they fell on me, held a flicker of surprise but no judgment. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp, "you were not expected until tomorrow." "Our plans changed, Mistress Croft," the Duke said. "This is a guest." He seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, his eyes glancing at my hand before he continued. "Her name is Alara. She will require a room and a meal, and something to wear that is not a wedding dress." The housekeeper's gaze took in my state, my disheveled hair, my tear-streaked face, the cheap muslin of my gown. She looked at the Duke, then back at me. A silent communication seemed to pass between them. She gave a small, sharp nod. "Of course, Your Grace. This way, miss." I followed her up a grand, echoing staircase, my footsteps lost in the vastness of the house. I was terrified. What was I doing here? I was a married woman who had abandoned her husband. I was a guest in the home of a man who was practically a stranger. My mind conjured visions of scandal, ruin, of being dragged back to Fenwick in disgrace. The hope that had flickered to life in the carriage was a fragile, terrified thing. I tried to smother it, to prepare myself for the inevitable disaster. Hope was a luxury I could not afford. The room Mistress Croft led me to was larger than the entire ground floor of my father's house. A fire was already blazing in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the heavy tapestries that lined the walls. A four-poster bed stood like a throne in the center of the room. It was a room of immense, lonely luxury. "A bath will be drawn for you," the housekeeper said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "And I will find you a suitable nightgown. Do you require anything else?" "No," I whispered. "Thank you." She paused at the door. "His Grace does not often bring guests to Blackwood," she said quietly. "You must be important." She left before I could respond, leaving me alone with her baffling words. Important? I was the opposite of important. I was a footnote in my own family's story. I walked to the fire, holding my hands out to the warmth. The gold ring on my finger caught the light, gleaming with malevolent beauty. With a surge of revulsion, I twisted it, pulling and tugging until my skin was raw. It would not budge. It was stuck, a permanent brand. I sank into a chair by the fire, and for the first time that day, I wept. I wept for my lost mother, for my hollow father, for the life I might have had, and for the gilded cage that was now my future. Later, after a hot bath that washed away the grime and some of the chill of my fear, and dressed in a simple, soft linen nightgown that felt like heaven against my skin, there was a soft knock at the door. I expected a maid, but when I opened it, the Duke himself stood there. He was holding a small leather-bound book. "Mistress Croft informed me you were distressed," he said, his voice low. He did not enter the room, but stood formally in the doorway. "I thought this might help." He held out the book. I took it, my fingers brushing his. A strange jolt, like static electricity, passed between us. His hand was warm and firm. The book was a collection of architectural sketches from the Italian Renaissance, a volume so rare I had only ever read about it. My breath caught in my throat. "How did you—" "My library is extensive," he said simply. "I recalled you mentioning Palladio's influence on early monastic design. I find his work offers a certain clarity, a logic that can be soothing in times of chaos." He was giving me a book, not a lecture, not a sermon on my duties as a wife, but a book. He was speaking to me not as a hysterical female, but as a fellow intellectual. The gesture was so unexpected, so profoundly kind, that it left me speechless. "I do not know what will happen tomorrow, Lady Fenwick," he said, his use of the hated title a stark reminder of my situation. His eyes were serious, the stormy gray depths unreadable. "But tonight you are safe here. No one will harm you under my roof. You have my word on that." He gave a slight formal bow and was gone, his footsteps receding down the long, quiet corridor. I closed the door and leaned against it, the book clutched to my chest like a shield. A prison of my own making, I had thought of my life. But perhaps, just perhaps, this man was offering me a key. The thought was terrifying, a spark of hope so bright it hurt my eyes. I was so used to the dark. The next morning, I awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the thick glass of the window. For a moment, I did not know where I was. The softness of the mattress, the warmth of the heavy blankets, the unfamiliar silence. It was all a world away from the narrow, cold bed of my childhood room. Then, memory rushed back in, a cold tide. The wedding. The flight. The Duke. I half expected to find myself locked in, a prisoner in this gilded cage just as I had been a prisoner in my father's house. But the door was unlocked. I dressed in the simple gray wool gown Mistress Croft had left for me, a garment of such quality and warmth it felt like an embrace. The hateful wedding ring was still on my finger. I hid my hand in the folds of my skirt as I made my way tentatively downstairs, drawn by the smell of coffee and baking bread. I found the Duke in a room that took my breath away. It was a library, but calling it that felt inadequate. It was a cathedral of books. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves soared upwards, connected by a delicate spiral staircase of wrought iron. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, and a series of tall, arched windows looked out over the bleakly beautiful moorland. He was standing at a large table in the center of the room, examining a set of architectural plans. He looked up as I entered, and his severe expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Good morning. I trust you slept well." "Yes, thank you, Your Grace," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I felt like an intruder in this sacred space. "Please," he said, gesturing to the table. "Join me." I approached cautiously. The plans spread across the table were not for a new building, but for a restoration. I recognized the layout immediately. It was the ruined abbey. My heart gave a painful throb. "You are restoring it?" I asked, my awe overriding my fear. "I am trying," he said, a note of frustration in his voice. He pointed to a section of the plan. "The western wall, the one you remarked upon. It is structurally unsound. My engineers insist the entire section must be demolished and rebuilt. They say the original design was flawed from the beginning." "They are wrong," I said, the words tumbling out before I could think. I leaned over the plans, my earlier timidity forgotten, my passion for the subject taking over. "It is not a flaw, it is a counterbalance. See here?" I traced a line on the parchment with my finger. "The architect was contending with unstable ground on this side. The cantilever is not supporting the roof. It is distributing the weight of the wall itself away from the weakest point in the foundation. It is brilliant. If you demolish it, the opposite wall will eventually collapse from the unbalanced stress." The Duke stared at me, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked from my face to the plans and back again. He walked to a shelf and pulled down a heavy, dust-covered ledger. He flipped through the ancient pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he stopped, his finger resting on a passage of spidery, faded Latin. "Let the west wall fly that the east may stand," he read aloud, his voice filled with a strange reverence. "The original builder's notes. I thought it was poetry." "It is," I said softly. "It is the poetry of mathematics." He looked at me for a long, silent moment. The air between us was charged with a new energy, the thrilling spark of two minds meeting and understanding one another on a level that transcended words. He saw me, I realized, with a dizzying rush. He saw the person I kept hidden away, the person no one else had ever bothered to look for. "My late wife," he began, his voice suddenly rough, uncharacteristically vulnerable. He cleared his throat and looked away toward the rain-streaked windows. "She was an architect. We bought this estate because of the abbey. We were going to restore it together." He paused, and the silence in the room was filled with the weight of his unspoken grief. "She died before we could begin. A carriage accident not far from here. The road was slick with ice." The confession hung in the air between us, a fragile, painful offering. The cold, severe Duke of Blackwood was a man hollowed out by a loss so profound it had sealed him away from the world. His solitude was not a choice. It was a scar. My own small sorrows felt insignificant in the face of his monumental grief. "I am so sorry," I whispered. He gave a curt nod as if to dismiss my sympathy, but his eyes, when they met mine again, were raw with a pain he could no longer conceal. "For 10 years, these plans have sat on this table. For 10 years, every expert I have hired has told me it was a fool's errand, that her vision for the place was impossible." He looked back at the plans, then at me. "You are the first person to see what she saw." In that moment, the dynamic between us shifted. I was no longer just a damsel in distress, and he was no longer just my powerful protector. We were two lonely souls who had found a point of connection in the shared language of stone and history and loss. Just then, Mistress Croft appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. "Your Grace," she said, her voice tight with disapproval, "you have visitors, Baroness Evangeline, and a man who calls himself Lord Fenwick." The fragile peace of the library shattered. The outside world, with all its ugliness and cruelty, had found me. A cold dread washed over me, so intense I felt dizzy. They had come for me. My brief sanctuary was about to be invaded. The Duke's face became a mask of cold fury. The vulnerable man of a moment ago vanished, replaced by the formidable, unassailable aristocrat. "Show them into the drawing room," he commanded, his voice like chipping ice, "and tell them I will be with them shortly." He turned to me, his storm-gray eyes holding mine. "You will not face them alone." His words were a shield, but as I stood there, my hand instinctively hiding the glint of gold on my finger, I knew this was a battle I could not let him fight for me. He had shown me that my voice was worth hearing. Now I had to find the courage to use it. The drawing room was a cold, formal space, all gilded chairs and unforgiving silks. Evangeline and Lord Fenwick were standing by the fireplace, a united front of righteous indignation. My stepmother's face was a carefully arranged mask of concern, but her eyes glittered with malice. Lord Fenwick, his face florid and his waistcoat straining at the buttons, looked like a thwarted bulldog. My father stood near the window, his back to the room, a portrait of ineffectual misery. My stepsister Isolde was there too, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable. "Elara, my dearest girl," Evangeline cried, rushing forward as if to embrace me. "We have been sick with worry, to run away like that. And with your mind in such a fragile state, we thought you had been taken." I flinched back from her touch. The Duke moved to stand beside me, a silent, unmovable wall of granite. His presence changed the atmosphere in the room, sucking the air from Evangeline's performance. "She was not taken, Baroness," the Duke said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She sought sanctuary, a sanctuary she was clearly denied in her own home." "Sanctuary?" Fenwick blustered, stepping forward. "She is my wife. She belongs with me. This is an outrageous breach of propriety, Your Grace. I demand you return my property at once." The word property hung in the air, ugly and obscene. I felt a tremor of rage, hot and unfamiliar, snake up my spine. The Duke's hand moved, a subtle gesture for me to remain silent, but the fire had been lit. "I am not your property, Lord Fenwick," I said, my voice shaking but clear. All eyes turned to me. It was as if a piece of furniture had spoken. I am a human being, and I will not go with you. Evangeline let out a tinkling, patronizing laugh. Oh, you see, Your Grace, she is not herself. The strain of the wedding, she has been prone to these fantasies, these delusions for years. She is a troubled, difficult girl. She turned to me, her voice dropping to a saccharine whisper laced with steel. Alara, darling, do not make a scene. You are embarrassing yourself. Come home now. Your husband is a forgiving man. He is a bankrupt vulture to whom you sold me to settle your gambling debts, I shot back, the words tasting like blood and freedom in my mouth. A shocked silence fell over the room. Evangeline's mask of concern cracked, revealing the raw fury beneath. How dare you? She hissed, her voice low and venomous. After everything I have done for you, I gave you a home. I found you a husband. You found me a jailer, I retorted, my voice gaining strength. You have spent the last 10 years trying to erase me, to make me feel so small and worthless that I would simply disappear. You told me I was plain, that I was strange, that no man would ever want me. You did it so you could control my mother's fortune, the inheritance you have been stealing from me piece by piece since the day you married my father. I turned to my father, who was still staring out the window, his shoulders slumped. And you, I said, my voice breaking with a decade of pain, you let her. You stood by and watched as she dismantled our family, as she extinguished every light in our home, as she broke my spirit. You did nothing. He finally turned, his face ashen, tears streaming down his cheeks. Alara, I'm so sorry. Before anyone could react, the Duke stepped forward, holding a sheaf of papers. I believe this confrontation is somewhat premature, he said, his voice cutting through the emotional turmoil with chilling precision. But since the accusations have been made, perhaps we should examine the facts. He looked at Evangeline, his eyes devoid of all warmth. Baroness, my solicitor has been rather busy this morning. He discovered, for instance, that the dowry you offered Lord Fenwick was paid not from your accounts, but from a trust established by Alara's late mother. A trust you have been illegally accessing for a decade. He also discovered a series of letters between you and Lord Fenwick, outlining an arrangement whereby he would marry Alara in exchange for the cancellation of your significant debts to him. He dropped the papers onto a small table. They landed with a soft, damning thud. Evangeline stared at them as if they were venomous snakes. Furthermore, the Duke continued, his gaze shifting to Fenwick. Lord Fenwick, it seems you are not just in debt, but utterly insolvent. Your estates are mortgaged to the hilt, and you have warrants out for your arrest in 2 counties. This marriage, being based on fraud and coercion, with the bride held under duress, is not only immoral, but also legally invalid. My solicitor is preparing the annulment papers as we speak. Fenwick's face had gone from red to a pasty mottled white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. And as for the matter of Alara's fragile mind, the Duke said, turning his cold gaze back to my stepmother, I have found her to be one of the most intellectually astute individuals I have ever had the pleasure of meeting. Her understanding of structural engineering alone is, frankly, astounding. He paused, letting the words sink in. It seems to me, Baroness, that the only delusion in this room is the one you have constructed for yourself, the delusion that you could commit theft and abuse without consequence. Evangeline's composure finally shattered completely. You, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. You did this, you little snake. You have ruined everything. It was Isolde who moved then. She stepped away from her mother's side and came to stand next to me. She took my hand, my right hand, and squeezed it. No, mother, she said, her voice quiet but firm. She did not ruin anything. You did. All these years, I did not see. I did not want to see. But I see now. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a shame and regret that was, for the first time, genuine. I'm so sorry, Alara. The fight went out of Evangeline. She stared at her daughter, her perfect creation, who had finally chosen a side. She looked at my father, who refused to meet her gaze. She looked at the Duke, whose face was a mask of implacable judgment. She was defeated, utterly and completely. Get out, the Duke said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of an iron command. All of you, leave my house. Fenwick, sputtering about his rights, was escorted out by two large footmen who had appeared as if from nowhere. My father walked to the door, paused, and looked back at me, his face a ruin of remorse. "Alara," he whispered, then shook his head and left. Evangeline, her face a contorted mask of hatred, gave me one last venomous glare before sweeping out, her dignity in tatters. Only Isolde remained. She let go of my hand. "I will make sure she cannot touch your inheritance," she said. "I will testify. I will do whatever it takes." She hesitated. "Can you ever forgive me?" "You were a child too, Isolde," I said, the anger draining out of me, leaving only a vast, aching emptiness. "You were just her other project." It was the kindest thing I could say. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and then she too was gone. The great drawing room was silent. The battle was over. I had faced my demons, and with the Duke's help, I had won. I stood there, trembling in the aftermath, the adrenaline ebbing away. I felt scoured clean, but also terrifyingly empty. My past had been excised, leaving a void. The Duke came to stand before me. He did not speak. He simply looked at me, his expression gentle. Then, very slowly, he reached out and took my left hand. My breath hitched. He looked down at the gold band, the symbol of my humiliation, the last remnant of the life that had just been dismantled. "This, I believe, no longer belongs to you," he said softly. His fingers were surprisingly deft. He worked the ring, twisting it gently over my knuckle, his touch warm and steady. It slid free. He held it in his palm for a moment, a small, glittering circle of lies. Then he walked to the fireplace and, without ceremony, tossed it into the heart of the flames. We watched as the fire consumed it, the gold melting and disappearing into the embers. It was gone. I was free. I looked up at him, my vision blurred with tears of a different kind now, tears of relief, of gratitude, of a profound and overwhelming catharsis. He had not just saved me, he had armed me. He had shown me my own strength. He led me from the drawing room, away from the ghosts of the confrontation, and out onto a stone balcony that overlooked the wild expanse of the moors. The air was cold and clean, smelling of rain and damp earth. It felt like the first clean breath I had taken in 10 years. We stood in silence for a long time, watching as the clouds broke apart, allowing shafts of pale winter sun to dapple the landscape. "What will you do now?" he asked at last, his voice gentle. "I do not know," I answered truthfully. The future, which had always been a narrow, dark corridor, was now a vast, open plain. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "I have my inheritance, it seems. I could find a small house somewhere. I have my books, my drawings." "You could," he agreed. He turned to face me, his tall frame blocking the wind. His storm-gray eyes were serious, but they held a light I had never seen in them before. "Or you could stay here." My heart skipped a beat. "Stay here?" "This house is too large," he said, a faint self-deprecating smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows of grief and severity. "It is too quiet, and the western wall of the abbey is in desperate need of an expert's eye." He took a step closer, his gaze searching mine. "Alara, I have spent a decade in silence and solitude, mourning a past I could not change. You have spent a lifetime being silenced, forced into a solitude you did not choose. When you spoke in that library yesterday, it was like hearing a song I had long forgotten." He reached out, not to take my hand, but to gently cup my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, a touch so tender it made me tremble. "I'm not offering you sanctuary from the world or a rescue from your past. You have already rescued yourself. I saw you do it. I'm offering you a partnership, a life. I'm asking you to share your mind, your passion, your voice with me." The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us on that windswept balcony. The cold, reclusive Duke of Blackwood was laying his scarred heart bare before me. He was not offering me a gilded cage, but a shared canvas on which to build a new life. "Alistair," I whispered, the name feeling both strange and perfectly right on my tongue. "I want to see the world through your eyes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I want to hear your theories on architecture and mathematics and the poetry of a well-placed stone. I want to stand with you by the abbey wall and watch you bring it back to life. I want you to fill the silence in this house and in my heart." He took a deep breath. "Alara, will you marry me?" Tears streamed freely down my face now, but they were tears of joy, of a profound, earth-shattering happiness I had never dared to imagine. I, the invisible girl, the inconvenient burden, was being offered a kingdom. Not a kingdom of wealth or status, but a kingdom of the mind and the soul. I could not speak. I could only nod, a frantic, joyful movement of my head. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. The smile that broke across his face was like the sun breaking through the clouds over the moor, brilliant and beautiful and full of promise. He lowered his head and his lips met mine. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was deep and sure and full of a quiet reverence, a sealing of a pact that had been forged in a dark carriage and solidified in a dusty library. It was the end of a very long winter and the first, breathtaking promise of spring. 1 year later, I stood on the scaffolding at the western wall of the abbey, a leather-bound sketchbook in my hand. The air was crisp with the scent of autumn, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley. Below me, a team of stonemasons worked, their hammers and chisels ringing out in a steady, rhythmic chorus. The wall was rising again, not as a copy of its former self, but as a stronger, more honest version, its brilliant, counterintuitive design finally understood and honored. A hand settled on the small of my back, warm and familiar. I leaned into the touch without looking, my eyes still fixed on the graceful curve of the newly set stones. "The master architect at her work," Alistair said, his voice a low murmur in my ear. I smiled, turning to face him. He looked younger than he had a year ago. The lines of grief around his eyes softened into laugh lines. The solitude that had clung to him like a shroud was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady contentment that radiated from him like warmth from a hearth. "It is our work," I corrected him gently. I tapped the plans laid out on a nearby trestle table, his bold handwriting intertwined with my more delicate script. We had spent countless hours in the library, debating, sketching, and dreaming together, our minds a perfect harmony. He looked from the rising wall to my face, his stormy eyes soft. "It is our life," he said. He took my left hand in his. A simple, elegant band of platinum, engraved on the inside with the Latin phrase, "Let the west wall fly, that the east may stand," now rested on my finger. It was not a shackle. It was an anchor, a symbol not of ownership, but of partnership. Blackwood Manor was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a home. Laughter echoed in the great hall now. The library was a shared space of comfortable silence and lively debate. Mistress Croft, who had become my staunchest ally and confidant, now smiled more than she frowned. Even Isolde visited occasionally, her relationship with me a tentative healing thing built on a foundation of newfound honesty. We walked back towards the house as the sun began to set, our arms linked. I thought back to the terrified, invisible girl who had hidden in a dark carriage, believing herself to be worthless. She felt like a person from another lifetime. That girl had been waiting for her life to be over. I was just beginning to live mine. Alistair paused, turning me to face him as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of rose and gold. He brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his touch as gentle and reverent as it had been on the day he proposed. "Are you happy, Alara?" he asked, the question simple, but the meaning profound. I looked up at the man who had not rescued me, but had simply seen me, and in doing so, had given me the strength to see myself. I looked at the home we were building, both in stone and in our hearts. I felt the solid ground beneath my feet and the endless sky above. I was no longer a ghost. I was real. I was valued. I was loved. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong, "I am."